hear me? Hopefully you can. Welcome to Bluefield State College and our first in a series of Black History Month of programming. I am Quavo Jones, Director of Counseling and Interim Dean of Students. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a couple things. If everybody could mute their computer, should be that microphone on the bar down there. That will kind of help us with feedback from the background. When we get to the question and answer section and the comment section, you can then unmute yourself, but then we would ask that you will remute. And one other thing is, we also would like to let you know that this event will be recorded. We're going to do things a little bit different this year. Normally we would have this in person, but with COVID, we felt like we need to keep everybody safe. And how safer can you be, either in your home or in your office? So we decided to do this virtually. Hopefully this time next year, we will be able to do it in person, but this year we're going to do everything virtually. Our first presenter in the series, we've got a series of 4 we're going to do during the month of February. Our first presenter will be Dr. Montague. And let me just briefly read his resume or his bio. Dr. Montague serves as Professor of History in the Social Sciences Department, specializing in American history, African American history, and race at Bluefield State College. Dr. Montague earned his Masters and Doctorate from Columbia University. His research focuses on American understanding of nationalism, political economy, and labor by the lens of class and race. His most recent research has been on examining the European philosophical underpinnings of Black suffrage and scholarship in the early 20th century. So without any further delay, let's bring on Dr. Montague.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm making sure that everything's working all right. Everybody can hear me okay? Okay, good. That sounds good. Anyway, I really am honored and it's a pleasure to have you guys. So I do encourage you to see the events for Black History Month. Today, the talk I'll be giving is on what's called racial realism. We're going to be looking at basically 3 questions. What is race role in the construction of the American experience and identity? What makes race systemically important component in the American democracy and culture and economy of modern America? And finally, what are some of the ways that we can really address some of the contradictions of having a quote unquote free society when there is systemic discrimination? So we're going to start there. But to start with, what exactly is racial realism? Well, the idea comes out of what is known as critical realism. It's a segment of philosophy that seeks to use empirical data to explain the reality of seemingly abstract ideas and concepts. So a concept such as race, which can be seen as abstract, and show what the real world effects of it are. Okay, critical realism is really concerned with the nature of causation, agency, structure, relations, and really what are the ways that these intersect with each other and create the society we have. Now, why is race itself critically important, and why is race realism important? Okay, well, when we talk about race realism, we realize that there wasn't really any kind of philosophy or any kind of approach to understanding what race itself actually was. And the way understanding race is both a concept, but having real world implications. So basically, we want to see that racial realism is looking at race as neither biologically or necessarily socially real, but it has real world impact and effects. So why is race critical in understanding the American experience and identity? Well, when he was speaking on July 25th, 1900, William Edward Bernhardt Du Bois proclaimed that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. While the color line he mentions was one distinguished by the dint of skin color, hair, the deeper meaning of his words reside in the reality that since the rise of commercial trade, there has existed and persisted in what Professor John Powell of Berkeley calls UC of Berkeley calls a system of exploitation and evolving mechanism of human sorting that accompanied the development of Western national economies and nations. The United States emerged on the world stage in the 1770s came at a critical moment when the question of enfranchisement of everyday peoples was finding a voice in countries throughout Europe, in England and France especially. So the first thing we must understand is, what are the principles that led to racism becoming a critical component? And the fact is that those principles that led to the development of the American Republic were not themselves ostensibly racial. Now, how are they not racial? Well, let's dive into that. Early scholars like Jefferson were fearful of granting unrestricted power and access to those who could not, because they would not or could not demonstrate the natural ability, talent, and the right type of thinking or ethics and values. Ultimately, writers and thinkers ranging from the English-born thinker John Locke to the American-born Thomas Jefferson concluded that there was a pre-existing natural hierarchy that, when properly instituted at the political and economic level, order, peace, prosperity would appear. The notion of equality, so widely celebrated, is largely misconstrued in our post-emancipation, post-civil rights era as meaning relative sameness within our political access, rights, and privileges. The idea being that no arbitrary restrictions exist in accessing the same institution, rights, and privileges. In fact, they should all be drawn basically on talented nature, okay? Jefferson himself was what's called a natural egalitarian, okay? His natural egalitarianism, which basically means where nature was the ultimate arbiter for determining political rights and freedoms, is fundamental in the construction of our republic. Jefferson's liberalism relies on natural equality of the person or group in question, on that person or group's ability not only to trade, but also to assimilate and integrate. Therefore, any existent social or political system must reflect, must enforce, and must facilitate the existence of the natural order. This kind of new American form of liberalism focused on individualism, demonstrations of individual worth, one that was not predicated on inherited titles, but based on rationalism, having the means, ability, and knowledge to effectively utilize one's rights, liberty, independent of the corruption and influence of others. One of the chief ways one can demonstrate their rationality was through wealth, through property accumulation. Early Republicans embraced a brand of liberal democracy, that was rather peculiar. Membership into the political community, or a citizenship, sometimes also known as personhood, was and still is determined by axiology, okay, which is basically the nature of studying the nature of the evaluation of certain types of people, places, or things for our purposes. And this kind of gives us a glimmer into why race was not only important, but was considered, in fact, necessary as a founding principle for our republic. Now, to extend the metaphor a little bit further, different levels of membership existed, meaning that at its core, while individualism was celebrated in principle, the dissemination of rights and privileges and the installation of functional economic political organization was based on systemic grouping. And those capable and willing to adopt the correct values and principles would be a part of a nation unified by shared values. Your grouping, which could be identified and understood in class, race, gender, and these things were usually and are interlinked, it gets to determine your level of inclusion or exclusion from the franchise. The denial of specific people as Republicans, because we are members of a republic, so as Republicans, basically showed that egalitarianism this type of egalitarianism demands a level of exclusion and even subjugation. Yet even this was keeping with the American liberalism, as the nature of lesser beings obligated the superior groups to oversee them, protect them, and provide for them. Dr. Charles Mills, argues that the advent of modern imperialism, moving from the 15th and 16th centuries onward, led to basically the development of what he calls a kind of racial contract between people who identified as white and those of quote unquote lesser races. This racial contract is in fact a perversion in its own way of the social contract. Now, those that could not demonstrate ability, or what some scholars label capacity, were limited and therefore their political and economic role, their rights and privileges. Moreover, those who could not demonstrate worth also showed that they had neither the right thinking, learning, and that maybe they could be provided for it depending on their natural limitations. The political system had to therefore ensure that such types of people who were inherently limited in their ability could never gain full access to the franchise, to the rights and privileges of governance and liberty, and corrupt and worse, imperil the welfare of the nation. The founders' understanding of race cannot and could not be separated from their vision of the American future. While they might have argued over the efficacy of using biological understandings of race, which they did debate about, there was large agreement that race was a vital tool in the republic's construction. In other words, the founders' egalitarianism was conditional. It was as much exclusive as it was inclusive. Revolutionary leader Alexander Hamilton has a nice way of putting it, if you will, and because he would disparage many of the masses as saying the masses were asses. Race was an early useful principle employed in establishing these systems that would permeate the culture from not only a political standpoint, but a cultural one as well. Race, for all intent and purposes, became viewed from a political standpoint as a form of vital property, and that the lacking of possession of which indicated you were unfit. The scholar Laura Underpinnings, she wrote a treatise. She's written a book now. She wrote a treatise on this called On Property. Basically said that if you lacked this vital property, this racial property, that you were basically seen as unfit to, quote, enjoy human rights, liberties, powers, and immunities that are important for a human being. This would include things like freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom from bodily harm, freedom from equal opportunities to have access to national resources. And you may have noticed this has a lot of similarity to the justification of slavery. The concept became a political form of property, privilege, and virtue that therefore was emanated in terms of policies. Even as society entered the 19th century and the industrial age, these ideas persisted and they took on new life. Race had been falsely tied to biology, and the use of pseudosciences like eugenics, social Darwinism were used as and viewed as rational means to explain the continued disenfranchisement of specific groups, even past the age of slavery. Keep in mind, this what I'm talking about here in principle is itself a transracial phenomenon, because it extends not only into the field of race, but also sex and gender. As American society slowly shed the bonds of this false understanding of race, this biological understanding of race, though one can argue to what degree have we fully done so, new values emerged to take its place that allowed for the continued justification for the systems upon which these principles were founded. In fact, racism as a concept really first appears in literature and thought, being uttered by 1940s assimilationists who came to see the idea of race increasingly as an impediment to the order and liberality that Americans so celebrated, particularly in the wake of the ethno-nationalist ideas of fascists in Europe at that time. Therefore, racism and race that were once embraced as politically virtuous began being challenged on multiple fronts by both white, Black, Latino, Native American activists. Latino activists such as Rosaló Munez, white scholars like Dr. Eric Foner, Francis Simpkins, Black leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Charles Houston, Houston, a lawyer for the NAACP, and later Dr. Martin Luther King, were all primary advocates for racial integration. Racism was, for these thinkers, an ideology that was ultimately antithetical to the nature of any liberal democracy, one that advocates for open competition in the workforce, markets, social access, shared ideas. Racism, in short, became increasingly primarily seen as totally ideological and interpersonal. In other words, is that it was a conscious belief that you enacted individually from one person onto another. Okay? Or as one scholar put it, you had a discrimination, a racial discrimination that stemmed from conscious personal prejudice. This has led publicly to the banning of certain words, ideas, behaviors in pursuit of a colorblind society, one that would serve the dual function of undoing the damage that racism caused to freedom and strengthening the nationalist ties that would exist amongst majority population and non-majority population, majority and minority populations together. Here's the trick to this that makes this a little difficult. Yet this liberal movement was predicated still on its own set of racial ideas. Specifically, the Lockean notion that specific values, behaviors, and beliefs were more functional, superior to others. So there was still that sense that there were a set of beliefs and values and principles that were still better, and you still need to embrace them. You need to assimilate. You need to accommodate them in your thinking in order to be a functional member of the nation. This has ultimately led into the 20th century into viewing any racial conscious thinking and behavior as problematic, its own variant of racism. Some scholars like Neil Guntondo has equated this to a type of psychic form of repression, pushing the label of racism much like it's a scarlet letter. Racism then, as an idea, becomes an external value because we're pushing it outwards onto the fringes. It becomes marginalized. That's the idea. Where in fact, if we talk about it in systemic terms, it's still rooted to the core of the structures and behaviors that we live by. But there was an acceptance past the 1940s and onward that we could push racism to the boundaries, and those outsider groups we could fend off with our laws and our common self-interest. But if we reject racism as solely interpersonal and we see it as systemic, then the role that race plays in our society is very different. And that brings us to the next question is what makes racism systemic? And what does that mean? When we're talking about systemic racism, what we're really talking about is a network of institutional structures that are bound together through rulings, ordinances, statutes that are promulgated by a sovereign government or an authoritative entity. Okay? These policies and practices, are always derived from an interlinked set of values or political, economic, social ideologies. But usually one of the consequences of them is that they restrict and undermine the liberty of recognized racial groups. Governments, economies, nations entirely, they typically operated based on a set of shared values that produced this interconnected network of bodies. So they would include, for example, industries, government bureaucracies, and they would work in cooperation with one another, creating these interworking systems that would have almost a mechanical operation to them that didn't operate arbitrarily based on the interest or self-interest of one group, party, or person. In other words, there was no one person who would determine how the system ran. It just ran regardless of time and place. It would still operate almost mechanically. Yet the reality is that the political and economic systems of the post-Enlightenment world after the 17th century are fundamentally hierarchical, built upon the assumption of equality, sameness, but reality is that's a natural impossibility. Now, The policies, beliefs, customs, and accepted behaviors that become entrenched in our institutions would mechanically, without the need of any conscious human bias, would mechanically discriminate between groups best suited to lead and those who are best suited to follow. This naturally results and has resulted in a permanent exclusion and promotion of designated racial groups. This can manifest itself basically in two ways. You have what's called institutional racism, and some would call structural racism, okay? So I'm just going to briefly kind of outline what those are in moving forward, okay? Institutional racism basically is racial discrimination that has been built into organizations, structures, institutions, if you will, that operate in cooperation with one another with shared common values and interests in the promotion of identified valuable functional peoples. When something is structural racism, what we're focusing much more are on those said systems. So sometimes structural racism is used as used simultaneously together with systemic racism, because structural racism looks at what are the inequalities and that are system-wide and how are they impacting said racial groups. Now, by the early 20th century, in this age of capitalism, wealth, science have become major factors in identifying those who are of political and social worth. And as capitalism has increasingly taken on throughout the 20th into the 21st century, importance in shaping our lives, our values, our beliefs, etc., okay, so it has taken on increased political significance as a means of not only shaping our economic fortunes as individuals, but also the political access that we have and how we iterate our own political values and beliefs through our rights, whether that be voting, running for office, etc. Now, as society became in the early 20th century increasingly diverse, reformers saw their republic potentially unraveling. Why? Because it was becoming increasingly in their minds lacking the ideological, ethnic, and cultural homogeneity that it had in the past. This led to an expansion of government involvement in shaping the social and economic values of the people directly. Okay? Their values were being increasingly dictated to by state and federal authorities in order to formulate a national inclusive identity, but one with limits and conditions. This really represented a kind of a new evolved form of liberalism that dictated a social contract that demanded the forced assimilation of varied ethnic groups. In other words, forcing them to be free. The introduction of mandated public education, the rise and expansion of law enforcement, the law courts, industrial laboring, provided opportunities to achieve a level of socioeconomic harmony in their minds that hadn't been experienced since the Republic. There were great advocates for this too. Horatio Alger, William Sumner, amongst others, who espoused that there were specific values that made people the best type of Americans, ideal Americans. Again and again, you see this in the ideas of Andrew Carnegie, Frederick Jackson Turner, amongst others, that demonstrations of individual worth, the celebration of the accumulation of wealth, were signs of merit, signs of ability. They agreed that the most successful people were the ones with the necessary skills, but they also believed and accepted oftentimes that God played a role in deciding who had those skills. Those incapable of doing, therefore, needed guidance, education, a paternal hand. The industrial practices, therefore, of the 20th century, Taylorism, Fordism, amongst others, were seen as opportunities for people to demonstrate the principle of individualism, so prized by the intellectual fathers of more than a century ago. The notion of worthiness, merit, became reinforced in industrial laboring, private philanthropy, cultural practices, including the Protestant faith. This produced new classes, including upper working class, petit bourgeois, the middle class, whose individualism was recognized by the accumulation of wealth and the power they were therefore accorded because of it. It became paramount for the nation's interest that the reins of power stayed in the hands of the most capable. This was, in fact, a reconceptualization of Jefferson's old 18th century brand of republicanism, but one now that had an industrial and cultural bent. Thus, democracy became conceived as the ultimate reward for those transformed into this new national entity. People who were industrial-minded, thrifty, workers who embraced aestheticism, and finally racism, which also for a time was seen as a positive good in the early 20th century. It was considered very progressive. In order to achieve this, individuals would be required to join the national body and effectively erase, destroy, or suppress their previous ethnic, quote-unquote, ethnic identities. People, specific ethnic groups, effectively started to disappear into this more amorphous entity known as the American. Race took on a new dimension as well. It took on a new dimension of importance in this period as different ethnic groups were pushed by social pressures, subordination, outright intimidation, state and federal mandates to surrender their ethnic identities. Though some of the more bourgeois-minded reformers, which included W.E.B. Du Bois, pushed for minorities like blacks to demonstrate their worth through embracing European cultural standards of education, dress, and even engage in national ventures like a war, demonstrating their nationalism, their patriotism, which he encouraged, for example, African-American young males to engage in war on behalf of America in 1917. However, we must not forget one of the things I talked about earlier. Racial grouping, a bedrock upon which this new form of nationalism was dependent, made full enfranchisement impossible for millions. In fact, to preserve the sanctity of this newfound nationalism, militant action was considered righteous and necessary. One thing that critical theorists have said about this new form of identity is that they've encapsulated it as a concept of what's called whiteness. That's one of the theories that they utilize, okay? That in order to sustain and maintain the unity of the nation, it obligated these new non-ethnic, quote-unquote, white citizens to act in concert with their indigenous white American-born neighbors. Violence became a means of demonstrating political virtue. Use of violence against the inferior races who would entreat upon your economic liberty, your political liberty, your Americanism was an obligation and duty. Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it succinctly. Capitalism required inequality and racism in creating American identity at that time period. Another scholar said this: the violence of nationalism is built on the logic of belonging, which I think is a nice phrase for our explanation here. Whereas today racism is oftentimes seen as an external corrupting influence, the reality is that individualism, the achieving of economic and social credibility, demands racial inequity. Concepts like meritocracy are founded on discrimination. And they are used effectively to identify people who are considered to be high risk, dysfunctional, un-American. These are the terms that have been used in the modern era instead of words like uncivilized, which is what you might have used in previous centuries. This also appeared, of course, in the field of politics throughout the late 1800s to the 1900s in the Jim Crow state laws that were being passed, instituting a limited form of democracy that routinely shut out people identified as mentally and physically ill-equipped. And again, when I say that, that should also tell you something. Again, this was a transracial phenomenon. It's not just limited to people based on race, but based on people who suffered from disabling handicaps, etc. So it wasn't just limited and applied to one frame. Previously, specific groups, or races in this case, routinely had been excluded on biological inferiority. People of an African background, Native American background, were born, quote unquote, unable to adapt and reason at the same level as others. And such ideas persisted through social Darwinism. But once biology was rejected as a conscious metric for success, the economic and political systems, as understood by people in the popular culture, became objective proving grounds that demonstrated the cultural and social inability of specific groups. So once you said that race rather, is no longer biologically determined, we can then accept that the political and economic systems are neutral. They're just proving grounds to show what you can do. That there is no bias there operating within those systems. That was the idea. That was something that a lot of people did believe in, particularly as we moved into the civil rights era. Once you got rid of the racist element of biology with race, we could operate and be successful as a society completely, regardless of what your racial identity was. And it became the truest iteration of an American liberal society. Ultimately, however, this notion of colorblindness had an interesting effect. Because if you embraced a racialized understanding of, let's say, a set belief, philosophy, or political system, you were branded somebody who was racist. So the racialization of the political system, of economic systems, was viewed by the majority population basically as a type of reverse racism. Colorblind racism, and the scholar, I think, Eduardo Bonilla Silva puts it nicely. He says, colorblind racism has rearticulated elements of traditional liberalism for racially illiberal purposes. Racial grouping and discrimination has remained a mechanism for regulating American liberties and meting out said rights properly. But now it does so in social and cultural terms. The worthiness of groups like African Americans, Native Americans, are oftentimes viewed by the majority population as suspect. Not because they're quote unquote inferior, but because their cultural practices, their ideas, their attitudes towards nationalism are problematic, or are viewed as inferior. As a result, these communities are never included wholesale into the sweeping nationalist trends that transformed ethnic Europeans into white Americans. So I keep talking about these systems. What are these systems that we're talking about? Let's talk about some of them specifically. Okay, the banking system is one that is extremely important. Okay, regularly people engage in risky ventures. Banks extend credit and purchase of for the sale of stocks and bonds, sometimes to lenders of dubious credibility. But this pattern of behavior, which leads to a boom and bust cycle for generations, has never really extended into minority neighborhoods that are often designated as high risk due to the little capital and social credibility that blacks have as a larger national body. Simply put, betting on black is seen as bad for business, a bad risk. Blacks are unable, therefore, to produce strong, independent businesses and routinely continue to work in what can be viewed as lower level and servile labor. The racial practices, in fact, of banks does not proceed oftentimes in a colorblind fashion in black neighborhoods. I'll give you an instance. Wells Fargo, for instance, recently had to settle a lawsuit with the NAACP for, I think it was something like $175 million. The suit alleged that customers were being steered towards high-interest subprime loans. These became known internally amongst the lenders as ghetto loans for the mud people. Black communities identified have been recognized as being a higher risk for bankruptcy. And as a result of that, they have far less access to tax-advantaged forms of savings, due in part to a long history of discriminatory practices. A well-documented history of mortgage market discrimination has meant and resulted in the fact that blacks are significantly less likely to be homeowners than the majority population, which means they have less access to the savings and tax benefits of being a homeowner. You also see this in our economy generally. The typical quote-unquote racially identified white family has 8 times more wealth than black family, 5 times as more wealth than the typical Hispanic family. Black families have a median wealth that is less than 15% of white families. Because African Americans tend to have lower income, they inevitably receive fewer tax benefits. Okay? Even if they are homeowners or have retirement savings account, they receive less benefits. There's inequities in the housing system. Okay. For urban and housing policy has traditionally for over a century has viewed certain neighborhoods and communities as bad risk for certain loans. Okay, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was an organization that routinely would identify high risk neighborhoods, and in fact they would create boundary lines around those neighborhoods. And today we know this famously as redlining. This was a common practice in the early 20th century. So blacks could not gain access to the required capital they need to buy better homes and become property owners. Housing audits, in fact, done in many locations, reveal that blacks, Latinos are denied available housing from 35 to 75% of the time, depending on the city in question. Another system, the criminal justice system. Okay. In brief, one thing I want to say, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So one thing I'm going to say in brief is that when we talk about the criminal justice system, one thing that has been occurring in modern policing from the 1800s and forward is that policing was focused, very much overtly focused on stopping disorder. Okay. This became increasingly defined around the needs of the mercantile interest, because merchants were viewed as great investors into neighborhoods. They would make neighborhoods healthy, wealthy, prosperous. They would help increase property values. So their interests were considered part of the national interest. Their taxes, their political influence, therefore, was to be embraced and reflective in the bureaucratic policing institutions that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this includes the federal agency known as the Bureau of Investigation, BOI, and later on the FBI. By the late 20th century, this has reemerged, this effort to stop disorder, as a war on drugs, a war on crime, a war on something. It has led to new stratagems like the 1970 stratagem of what's known as proactive policing, which includes things like stop and frisk. As one scholar put it, he said, basically, the emerging commercial elites needed a mechanism to ensure a stable and orderly workforce, a stable and orderly environment for the conduct of business, for the collective good. But it's not just found when we talk about with policing, there's also in the justice system, that being the courts. With the shift in the modern age towards non-discriminatory racial policies, systems that were founded on a prescriptive set of values, including subservience to authority, have oftentimes found minorities having to become much more vulnerable because they have no means by which to demonstrate what the bias is. If there's no conscious bias, then they have no problem. They are simply have the same access as everybody else. Yet the outcomes show that this trend is not the case. A black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped without cause than somebody who's white. 65% of black adults have felt themselves targeted because of their race. Approximately 35% of Latinos and Asians have felt targeted because of that as well. Fatal police violence is the sixth leading reason for the death of people, particularly males, between the ages of 25 and 29 across racial groups. In the 1990s, for an African-American male such as myself, I had a better chance of ending up dead or in jail than going to college. Statistically, that is what's shown to be the case. Now, do these show that the individual police officer or judge or et cetera is overtly or personally racist? Do they, in other words, have an animosity towards a specific racial group? No. Whether that exists or not is not the point here. Whether the officer is good or quote unquote a bad apple has little to do with the values and policies driving the tactics used in policing. The invested resources from government are decidedly placed in communities that are considered to be more fiscally sound, that are considered to be better bets, These communities have what's called an insider credibility, an insider status, in a way that others, the outsiders, do not. The degree to which one community merits financial interest and support varies, and the evidence is found in the disparities that exist across racial groups across the board. Now, the concept of a multiracial democracy has generally been roundly rejected time and time again in the court system. In the famous case Washington v. Davis, this was a well-established case that requires any plaintiff challenging the constitutionality of a neutral or neutral law. They have to prove that there is racial discrimination on the part of the lawmaker or the person implementing the law. In a systemically racial system, however, that task is nearly impossible. Racial disparity, racial discrimination will always be viewed in people's minds as either incidental, collateral, or unintentional, never deliberatively racist. The justice system has always been intent on seeing folks as individuals, but when a system is founded on grouping, a grouping that's meant to empower and disempower, the result is inevitable. Now, I'm going to move on briefly and talk about finally the third question that I wanted to bring up for our conversation today is, what do we do about these things? First thing, what are the consequences of it? What are the consequences of everything I've been speaking about here? Well, one of the consequences is that there's a lot of challenges within minority communities themselves. There exists within minority communities what's called intraracial tensions, a black-brown dialogue, okay? One of the challenges is that racial grouping amongst those different groups themselves is problematic. So the racial grouping of somebody who is quote-unquote Latino is problematic because the term itself is almost useless in understanding a distinctive racial identity, okay? The term Latino can be racially understood as a cultural outsider status, but also a racial insider status, depending on that specific Latino group or nation. The expression of people of color has become, in a clumsy way, a kind of diasporic phrase, okay, indicating a common or shared anti-colonial oppression or conjoint oppression amongst self-identified non-whites. The idea behind this is to establish a political bulwark amongst minorities against systemic racist policies that impact them all, though arguably in different ways. So what should these groups do about that? Coalition building has been and remains an important feature within minority communities and has been since the 19th century. External political and social coalitions that must exist independent of the majority culture are of paramount importance. Groups like La Raza, BLM, NAACP are able to put together multiple networks and coalitions that work in cooperation with one another. They can do so in promoting policies that would serve the interests of underdeveloped and underrepresented communities. They could also work together to provide protections against the economic and legal consequences of any sort of systemic racism. This idea is not new, by the way. Organizations like the NAACP, Southern Poverty Law Center, were created to serve initially citizens from across multiple racial groups, Black, Latino, immigrants who were in need of support and protection. But even as these coalitions are built, there also needs to, in conjunction with that, there needs to be what are known as intra-racial networks, those that have to exist across class and political lines. Over time, you've seen class diversity amongst people within a certain racial group, and that's caused a lot of what's called intra-racial tension. So they disagree on policies of law enforcement, taxation, etc. So they become separated, and they start joining one group, one party, the other, and there's no cohesion amongst that identifiable racial group. Intra-racial networks across class and political lines is important. In fact, I would say it's critical, okay? Because they become isolated communities that become vulnerable to people who are not in their interest. Finally, there is community policing. Community policing actually has a long history in both this country and in Europe. In fact, that was some of the earliest form of policing, was not a state-centric form of policing, but community policing. So community-centric activities are also critically important in making a community policing a standardized practice, one focused on rehabilitation, de-escalation, and systemic reform. It's premised on the idea that the people, the public, should be a fundamental part of policing and not just left up to the government or any individual institution. That they are not simply the recipients of policing, they are themselves directly involved in the process. Community policing must remain a foundational part of a society as a way to deal with challenges that are also endemic to those said communities, including things like intra-racial violence, intercultural violence, etc. Okay? Organizations like A Safer World are currently in the process of attempting to help to expand and implement this idea on a larger national scale, and arguably, depending on how successful they are, on an international scale. Anyway, I know that's a lot, and I appreciate your guys' time, and I hope that I've been able to provide some interesting ideas and insight for people to kind of chew on about this subject. And I'm more than happy to talk about anything specific that I discussed or something that you believe would be valuable to add to this conversation moving forward. And to that, I appreciate it, and I'll open up for people to ask questions, please. Okay?
Any questions, just please unmute your mic.
Unmute, yes, please.
No comments?
Can we also type into the chat box, Dr. Montague?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
It's not open there.
Oh, it's not? Okay, it is now. Go ahead. There he is.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, comments, etc., please don't be hesitant. These ideas are, it's part of an ongoing conversation, so I'm more happy to discuss it.
Okay.
I've got one from Dr. Chakrabarty. Give me 1 second, guys. Can you briefly expand on the link between community policing and intra-racial violence? Okay. Yeah, yes, I can. I can talk about that. Okay. The fact is that one of the things that's been a large debate that's been happening, and particularly with the expansion of things like stand your ground, make my day laws, etc., is how do we deal with violence between people in a specific community, and understanding what role that may race in how the violence and why the violence is occurring. And the fact is that communities have pushed for solutions that the state and on the national level have been reluctant to embrace. So, for example, the introduction of mandatory minimums was something that devastated minority communities. So it's something that community leaders have pushed against for quite some time. Okay. And so one thing is that community policing and development of resources and institutional resources within those communities that are not dependent on external resources of enforcement would be valuable to help to deal with the crisis within those said communities. Okay, finding solutions that are internal to themselves, because they know their people, they know what the challenges are, and they know the people personally, and they can connect with them. They can develop methods and stratagems that would be of value, so that we can avoid what we have now, which is a huge prison population that outdoes pretty much every other country, certainly every other Western country, in terms of prison populations, because we find that the recidivism rates can be fairly high. Just putting people in prison, good chances are they're going to come back in prison. By community policing, they can create tactics by which to help things. One of the tactics that's used is what's called the scared straight. So it's other former gang members, former leaders who help to create techniques and tactics to help bring people out of gangs successfully into and reintegrate themselves into the community in healthy ways. Any questions? I can, or a topic you find of interest in this, I'd be happy to discuss.
Dr. Montague, Kurt Landefeld.
Mr. Landefeld, pleasure.
I'm in the middle of Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, and
yes.
wanted to know if you could quickly overlay some of her ideas against what you just presented today.
Oh yeah, there's oh dear. Okay, I'm going to try to do that in brief, but it's a great question. I really appreciate the question. One of the big debates that Black scholars have, and for those who don't know, one of the debates that scholars of African American history and race theory discuss quite a bit is if there are systems put into place and there are these groupings we talk about, do they equate to a caste, basically to an identified socio-political group of people who have defined limits and obligations in terms of what they are. So it's not simply a class, but it's called a caste. So they have a specific political, economic, cultural role to play. And so the one of the theories is that the construction of our country demanded the formation of a caste system, one that's evolved over time that exists regardless of whether there's slavery or not slavery, etc. So this is obviously a hotly contested debate. I mean, where I lie on it is and because I'm a fuddy-duddy, I've been told, is that to equate something to the level of caste, it would have to be, I think, much more specifically, critically outlined of what that caste is. In other words, it would have a much more overt legal representation within the law. And it would have to be at the national or federal level. It would be, in other words, completely top down. It would have to be entrenched into the language overtly, literally in the body of the Constitution or its said amendments. And that's never really been the case. So the debate over whether or not do blacks, for example, rise to the level of caste and what would that mean is a question, because it's an evolution of the old idea of a second-class citizen, because if you have a second-class set of citizens with a distinct set of rights and parameters and conditions under which they live under, how does that not equate to a caste? Well, the issue is that we live in a society where a lot of that is done at the state level, it's done at the community level, it's done at the municipal level, where those communities are self-determining what your role in that society is, which is why, for example, in the 19th century, for example, blacks, amongst other groups, would leave white society entirely and create their own communities, black communities. In fact, there is a community, I'm not joking, and I swear to God, I'm not joking. There is a community called Negro County, which is I'm not joking, hand to God, you can look. I have a colleague of mine who works there, who lives there. He teaches over at Howard, who in Negro County, because it was the investment and development of these black communities. Don't forget, in the early 20th century, these black communities, we started to see some traction and growth, became devastated and destroyed through racial violence. Part of the reason for that was because they wanted those people to work in white communities in a specific way. They wanted them to be subservient. Once they gained economic and political independence, then they were not going to be so easily controllable. And that was a big issue. So if it's a caste, that really would never have been possible. But it's still a very useful way of thinking, because it does provide some enlightenment of how we can shape and define for ourselves the boundaries of being a minority person in the culture and society of today's world. So that's my brief little talk about it. But it's a very good book, and she's a really great scholar. Dr. Adam Turner says, do you see similar issues with racial fairness? I deliberately do not use the term equality in the UK as here in the US. Can we learn from each other? The way to think about it, particularly since I talked about the development of internal and inter and intra-racial networks. The question is, where does that leave people who would not naturally be part of them, who would be outside of those networks? What you develop are, and again, this goes back to an old idea. I'm going to steal from Du Bois, the good borrow, the great steal. So I'm going to steal from Du Bois. And by the way, he talked about it here, developing cooperatives, networks of cooperatives to cooperate with other communities and work with them in cooperation. Today, we're very fond of the word alliance. To create allies. I find that term problematic, because I don't think you want to create alliances. I think you want to create networks in which each can help bolster and strengthen one another and come to mutually agreed, common, mediated solutions in the interest of each other. So I prefer the work to create cooperatives, network solutions. This is an idea that has existed amongst early 20th century socialists for decades. In fact, the idea of creating interracial cooperatives was suggested here at Bluefield State College by one Dr. E.B. Du Bois, because he said the business school would be a great place where Black business owners could help develop communities and of interest for other people, basically an intra-economic network. And so that was discussed as a potential direction for the business department at that time to go in. This would have been around the 1920s. Are there any questions I can answer? I'd be glad, or things. Don't be shy. You guys, a lot of you know me, so I'm more than happy for you guys to talk to me.
Dr. Montague, I think that's about it. We certainly appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
As a reminder, this was our first in the series, and we certainly like to start things with one of our own, Dr. Montague. Next week, it's going to be Dr. Daniel Wells. He's going to talk on the stigma of Blacks in healthcare. Where do we go from here? It will be Thursday, February 11th at 2 p.m. Information will be coming. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.